Awesome. Okay, we can pick up introductions again. Kanika, if you want to rewind the tape, if you don't mind, so we can capture that on the recording, I'd appreciate that. Welcome everyone to this presentation of Family Resource Navigators presenting on middle to high school transitions.
Awesome. So hi, my name is Kanika Kannan. I'm an assistant director at Family Resource Navigators. I'm a parent. I'm a mentor parent. I'm a volunteer. I am a CAC member at my SAPA, a PTSA member. I'm an advocate. So lots of different hats for our kids. And I'm passionate about inclusive education and with strong educational outcomes for all students. So I'm excited to be here and talk about transition to middle and high school. Again, one more time at North Region SALPA. So welcome all. Thank you for coming. And thanks for having us. April?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for your time this evening. So my name is April Keeley. I am a program manager at Family Resource Navigator, specifically in the Family Empowerment Center program. So I did hear mention of the new procedural safeguards. So the new version, if you flip to the back, it will have Alameda County's FEC agency, which happens to be Family Resource Navigator. So I am there. I'm also a parent of 2 boys who are in the special education system where we are, and they keep me tremendously busy. So first and foremost, I'm a parent. I'm also a family navigator here, assisting families and really guiding, those who ask for support, realistic roadmaps, where they are and where their children can be, as well with families' needs as well. And parent volunteer. I've been a PT officer for many years, and so have experience with that. So again, thank you for your time.
April, would you like to share slides or would you like me to?
If I can share on my end, if I have the ability.
So as we are sharing our slides, one of the things that would be nice to know is how many here are parents of incoming middle schoolers or high schoolers. So let's start with, are there parents who have students in elementary school at this time? If you could just raise your hands. I see. 3. So 4, 5, maybe 5 or 6. You have students in elementary who would be going into middle school perhaps in the coming fall. How many of you have, okay, let me see. So about 6, and how many of you have kids who are, or youth who are in middle school and who are going to be transitioning to high school or are already high schoolers? All right. All right. Thank you so much. So this will help us kind of guide our presentation as we can present information which is hopefully more relevant and informative for you as we go along. Should we go to the next slide? April? Okay, that is all about me, and we can move on. The one after.
And that is me as well.
Just a little bit about who we are. If you're new to knowing about Family Resource Navigators, we would be probably about 30 years in the community in probably next year. And we've been serving families in Alameda County. And we are located in San Leandro at this time. We have multilingual and multicultural staff. We speak between all our 30 different staff, 30 staff we have. We speak about 15 languages. So we got a really good breadth of the languages and the community that we serve. Most of our staff pretty much are parents themselves or have experiential knowledge of being a family member or of a child or an adult with a disability. And all our staff are extensively trained and mentored across all wraparound services that are available for families. So our philosophy is strengthening families, and our objective is to mentor and coach families to do this for themselves. We support families for IEPs, 504s, all the way from early start through adulthood, across Lanterman Act, regional center services, basic needs, Medi-Cal, IHSs, SSI, and many of the other 3-letter acronyms that we face constantly through the special needs world. So we got all of this. And our motto is that you got this when you come to us. Next slide. All right. So I like to start with this one slide because this kind of brings together the essence of the purpose of IDEA and the educational framework that we have. That is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. It's very clear it is all 3 prongs. So as we are thinking about our children from pre-K or kindergarten, or whenever we enter a special education to be, all these 3 portions, these 3 things are the most important things about the purpose of IDEA and why we are here. What is that post-secondary outcome? What is that after high school thing we are thinking is further education, employment, and independent living? Next slide. With that, we tried to build these slides around what we wish we knew before our child entered middle and high school. As parents, we know that transitions are always complex. When we entered the school system, perhaps in preschool, transitioning from preschool to elementary, and then going through elementary where you have one teacher, maybe more scaffolded classrooms, lots more peer interactions, smaller schools, and suddenly you are in high school. So we took this to what are different things that happen around middle and high school, and how does transition work? And so we looked at it through the angle of what changes on a day-to-day basis for children, for students. Their academic schedule changes. It's very varied between elementary and secondary schools. And then how does that change in terms of expectations in academics, in terms of social life, in terms of connectedness? What changes in terms of friendships? Like, how does the social connection change? Where does all of this fit into this teen years that students are also facing in terms of their own self-advocacy, their selfhood, and their autonomy, and the expectations that secondary schools have, like middle and high schools, how varied that can get? And how do you bring all of this together, which are all day-to-day things, and build yourself to think, how do I plan for the future at the end of this? Because each of those daily things add up to something, and what the big picture breaks it also down, so it kind of goes both ways. So these are the 5 things we would be talking about today in the next 30 minutes before we can pause for question and answers. Next slide. So let's talk about academic scheduling, and April and I will go back and forth. So if I miss something, just pause. So the first thing that changes for all students, and it is what we are focusing in on, is what can be much more challenging for, not for all of our children, but for some of our children, would be that schedules are confusing. Like suddenly you've gone from one teacher staying in one room for maybe a substantial portion of the day and having a couple of prep classes, to moving around every period, going with a different set of students. So you have cohorts of groups, maybe you have like 25 different students for English, and then the next period you go to math, and you have another 20 new peers. And then you go to science and you have additional new peers. So scheduling is confusing. It may or may not work for everybody. It's something to think and plan about it. So some schools also have block schedules. It's much more common in high schools, but perhaps some of us have already seen it because of the pandemic and how distance learning was organized. But a block schedule is basically a scheduling where usually you replace one period by a full block of, say, 90-minute period. Like instead of a 45-minute single period, that becomes a longer class. How could that be challenging for some of our students who would need, who have perhaps a sensory need to move, they need a break? It's a lot of work for, if you have a 90-minute class, the density of the course changes. And maybe you need assistance with note taking. Maybe you need accommodations around attention. So some of those things start coming in. So since that information is going to be dense, there's need for sustained concentration. How do you get all of this? So that could be something that could become challenging for some students. Then transition between classes. So most schools have this one ways and traffic around how do you move between one classroom to another. Campuses are much bigger. So you got to plan from, if you have a class at one end of the campus to the other end of the campus, if my student has motoric needs, how are they going to access that? If my student needs to have a bathroom break, how do you work that out? How do you, if the student has sensory needs, these spaces, these corridors could be really noisy. So how do you address that? So some of those things can be challenging, some things to think about as you think about how would my child move from this elementary school into middle school. Final scheduling, both in a middle, not so much, but in high school, finals emulate college. So at the end of the semester, you may have like 3 days of finals, like 2 exams a day, 2 hour schedules. How would that work for your kid? Extracurricular activities are important. So there'll be clubs which come up during lunchtime. There might be something before school or after school. There are rallies. There is a lot of other things that are happening in high schools. Those are all designed to be spaces for social interaction and making those connections possible. How does that impact your child? How would they be able to access that? So these are kind of some of the things that suddenly come up as you plan for your student to get to middle and high school. Next slide. So some of the things that we wanted to put is, and this is how we have done it, like when you think about all of this, you could think about, okay, how it all seems like a lot of information. How could you address this in a way that would make sense for your youth, for your student, and will work for them? So how do you bring this into the IEP and make this part of your discussion? So you could figure out with your team, collaborate with your team, and collaborate ahead to understand, so what does an academic schedule look like? What should we be expecting? So if I know that this is going to be really hard, can I build in some amount of break between during a block period? Would it help my student if I can get the schedule ahead of time for them? Are they able to get a walkthrough of the campus before school starts? Can they go and meet up with some of their teachers? So some of those kind of things could already be built into your IEP, which will make it much more smoother as they transition into middle or high. Students can use buddy system. So you could think about how could you build a peer group so they have support in navigating between classes. You can figure out a way to schedule finals. Remember the individualized part of the IEP. This is where everything gets focused. And as you think about these accommodations, if you think that these would be needed by your student long-term, it's important that they are documented into the IEP, because that enables your student to participate in a meaningful way and access their education. So finals can be scheduled in a way that works for students. Students with IEPs can get those kind of supports and services that they may need in participating in extracurricular. Remember that IEPs are not only for the academic portion, not only for what happens, it is also in accessing any other extracurricular activity that is provided for all students on campus. So talk about all of this in an IEP. We could provide you some examples of accommodations that are possible, which can help with time, which can help with fatigue, and think about what that means for your student, and then bring those to the team as your concerns and figuring together what is a good way to address these. April? You want to talk about this?
Yes. So, so I'm going to talk about, just expectations and realistic expectations. Oftentimes, when I speak as a parent, things that we're so, as Kanika mentioned, we're so used to our child being in elementary school. I like to tell my children they have one boss for the day. And now in middle school, they have more than one. And so many individuals and new friends potentially, but just, just a bigger location, lots of expectations, a lot of changes, and physical education is one of them. It's not something that a lot of parents necessarily or even family members always think about. But for those of us who are familiar with Western education, at least the physical education portion, we have uniforms, we have changing rooms. And is thinking about your child, are they able to independently change out of their school clothes, put them away, be organized, understand the concept of personal space and privacy. And even for students, with other, social emotional sensitivities or sensory needs, is that a challenging experience? And sometimes it could be very new and overwhelming. Just some parent considerations and some things that I've done is, just the summer before, we actually practiced how to change out of clothes and into a t-shirt and shorts. In terms of physical education requirements, things like running the mile, that was something that was not necessarily anticipated for my children, but just practice the experience of walking around a track. And we practiced during the summer. Just what is it like either to walk a mile, to run a mile, just activities that required endurance. For some of us parents where the disabilities might involve fine or gross motor needs, just those things to think about, and to talk with the IEP team about, what are some of the physical education requirements that are needed. I'll be transparent for my younger son who wears hearing devices, things like when the season gets hot or cold, is there staff who's able to troubleshoot in case something happens? Because while, transition to middle school or high school, our children are more independent, sometimes, you need an extra set of eyes. So how can that be built into the IEP? Other expectations to think about is just homework load. It's very different. There are expectations in terms of, long projects, whether you're working in groups with other people. Sometimes there are varied assignments or scaffolded assignments where you're working on a project or reading a book, one book across a month, and how especially if you've heard of the word executive functioning, in terms of, being able to plan and prepare schoolwork, assignments, how will that look for with your child? Does that need to be discussed as an IEP goal potentially, as a transition goal, even in elementary, preparing for that? Or in terms of, just working with other students, is your child need particular accommodations, or are there assistive technology devices where, your child can communicate with another classmate? My son uses a speech to text tablet so that he's able to hear in loud environments, so that he's able to read captioned conversations and be able to interact with his classmates. So, those different changes, and every child is different, especially in what their needs are in their IEP. But, a lot of, again, expectations in terms of academics, as well as socially, just, working, especially as a, if you're a middle schooler, beginning, usually either parents get worried about, well, this is my child is the smallest one in the school, and being able to navigate and understand those, big transitions, big expectations. And so being able to, work with the IEP team about that. One of the questions I get a lot as a parent too was, site visits. Is it okay to visit, the receiving middle school, or visit the receiving high school? And the short answer is it should be yes, as long as it's, you have a supportive IEP team that is able to provide, site visits. And as I've mentioned, I've used summer as a way to practice. Other things in order to understand realistic expectations is that if you have an elementary schooler or middle schooler, the receiving school with, if there's a high school open house, or if there's a middle school open house, that is a great opportunity to go see what those expectations are like, and to see, the classroom environment, the settings, even meet some of the teachers. So just, there's more than one way for the IEP to consider various options, but these are just some of them. In terms of solutions, IEP solutions to consider, I mentioned about talking about physical education requirements in the IEP, and talking about changing into a uniform. The other thing to think about is, especially with middle school and high school, one of the challenges that from experience with my children's friends was practicing the use of combination locks. If you have a middle school or high school that uses that, remember understanding how to use it for one, remembering the combination, especially if you have a child with certain executive functioning needs, being able to remember how are those supports going to be provided for that child. Practicing navigating through the campus, as Kanika mentioned, it's a bigger school, many different hallways, how are they labeled? Some of the things in terms of certain accommodations. I know, what is the school map? I am having perhaps a school map in the student binder, the child's schedule in a school binder, so that the student can reference that. Or if there's particular staff members, if there's a study skills class where, a staff member can help with transitions or priming or front loading in the morning, or perhaps after school. Those are some things to consider. In terms of, things like group projects, how is that going to look if, working in groups, is challenging for that particular student? What are some of the things that the general education teacher can do to support that? Being able to, being able to have your child work with other students who are very collaborative. Some of you might have heard a type of tool called a one-page profile, which helps. Kanika, I don't know if you want to chime in on that, but I know for my son, when having that one-page profile just captured in a snapshot, and one of them was being able to work in groups. I mentioned my son uses particular types of equipment. So making sure that when my son was working in groups, that there was a pass around mic, that his device was active so that it could caption and so that he could be an inclusive student in those types of group projects, and having those types of accommodations. When there was issues with homework, is there extended time where he would be able to do the homework at a particular time, and then check in with the teacher and be able to turn it in maybe a day later, or it's something that can be worked out with the IEP team. So I know it's one perspective or one option, but again, it's something that, with those types of solutions in terms of expectations, it's very individualized, especially with modifications and accommodations, asking things like whether it's middle school, whether it's high school, a student is using a locker. If for some reason using a locker is not something that's doable for a particular student, again, perhaps they're having trouble with their locker or they can't remember. Is there a study skills classroom, or is there another designated classroom where a student can leave their belongings in a safe space? Things to consider. When I know I'm bouncing around topics, but if there's group projects, what are some of those accommodations that can be used? If writing, taking notes is proving challenging, can that particular student use their cell phone or a school device like a Chromebook to be able to take pictures of the notes, so that if there are writing needs or challenges, then can that be an accommodation? So just some of the different things to think about and to consider in terms of expectations. It varies, every middle school and high school has very different social and academic dynamics. And so one of the things to consider is, as I mentioned, scheduling that one private tour at a middle school or at a high school with IEP team, that is doable. And this is actually different than the classroom scheduled visit to the middle school and high school. Having something a little bit more individualized can be more meaningful for that particular student.
All right, let's talk about friends and social connections. So one of the things that changed, did somebody have a question or, okay. So I just want to go back to what April said a minute back about visiting placements and looking at middle or high school. One thing to consider is this is kind of end of March. And as you would remember, if you request an IEP, you are probably already starting to have your transition meetings or are in the process of having something scheduled. If you really think that your child's individualized need requires that you need to have this visit with campus, request for an IEP meeting already and state so that these are some things that you would like to discuss as part of your transition IEP meeting, because then you have 30 days by which the district needs to schedule a meeting. So you have the option to go and visit before school ends this year. So that would be one aspect of it, to be able to see some of your placement options before, and try to also build this into your IEP if this benefits you. For some students, going the first day into school without having visited is very significantly anxiety producing on the basis of their disability, or maybe it would be very exhausting and unnerving for them. So then try to figure out that you could figure with your team that they have an opportunity to visit the campus when it's quieter, maybe the day or two before school starts, when the campus is quiet and it doesn't have like this. My daughter's high school campus is 2,400 students. So without the 2,000 students in campus, she can get an opportunity to go and see her school and get an idea of how to navigate. So she's a little bit more prepared for first day of school than otherwise. One of the things that changes with elementary and middle, in elementary, most students are with their same set of peers for the entire year. They are moving along together because they're all classmates for English, math, and so they are pretty much 30 students in a classroom, give or take whatever our class sizes are. But that changes in middle and again changes in high school, because in middle school, although you might have one elective and most others are core classes that are already set, schedules might be different. Their friends, their close circle of friends may not be in the same classes with them. They could be assigned to a different English period, for example. Then those kind of things make meeting together as friends much harder. So that is in some ways addressable. While you cannot say, I want Carolyn, Jill, and Kelly in my class, you could make that request that my child really needs that set of peers in the class. How could we make this happen, right? And engage in those conversations with your team. So there is some level of social dynamics and connectedness that you could already help set up. Then as they grow into middle and high school, teenagers are teenagers, they are becoming their own adults, and that's really what we want for all our students. Social perceptions can change. There are studies which talk about social isolation and anxiety and depression, and a lot of dropping out of high school or not wanting to go to school comes out of this feeling that you do not have a friend, and you do not feel like going to school because there is not something that you're not able to look forward to. So become aware of, are these things happening to your child, and how would you want to look at those kind of things, and how could you address those kind of things as a team? How would you build together lunch buddy groups or peer buddy groups and circles that can actually exist and could easily be done within schools? How could you make those kind of things happen? Bullying can be really high, especially for students who have invisible disabilities. So that is also something to really pay attention to and look into your school culture, talk about different things. How do you build disability awareness without calling out on students, because it's also an age where they're exploring their own selfhood as to who they are. Next slide. So here are some things that you could consider that we put up, that extracurricular activities like clubs are a great place for making new friends, coming into some special interest group. Like there could be robotics clubs in schools, there are language clubs in schools, there are activity clubs in schools, there are like a whole lot of things. So get to know what clubs are there, what activities are there, and see what meshes with your students' interests. And so they have an opportunity to make new friends, and also to guide them to think that this is an opportunity, because there are more number of elementary schools coming together in this middle or high school. So there is a lot more new students. So there is a possibility that there would be more other students who they didn't know before who have similar interests or shared interests. How could you schedule lunch or PE with friends from elementary or middle school who have been grown up together, so they have buddies who they already know? So clubs are a great way. Best buddies, if there is not an existing club in your school, suggest it, and see how you could support the school in bringing a new club together. Most high schools have a procedure for how to get these clubs started. So if isolation is a problem and it's continuing to affect your child, request for a counseling or a mental health service, and talk to the counselors at school. And so again, it's very important to just be aware and bring things to the IEP team, because there is no small question, there is no small concern, there is nothing about it. If there is a concern, there is a concern, and we want to bring it to the team and cumulatively try to come up with a solution. Next slide. So self-advocacy and autonomy. Expectations in middle and high school change. So you would see that there's less and less of flyers coming home, parents getting the information from teachers, not class dojos and any of the other tools that exist in elementary, our children are considered mostly grown-ups as they enter middle and high school. So most information teachers wanted to flow through students to parents. So if the flyers are in the backpack, if you don't know about the back to school night because your student was told that in Google Classroom and nobody knew about it, then you have a problem. There's a challenge, right? And for many of our kids, that could be challenging. They heard something, they knew something, but they could not really bring it back home. Or maybe your student has a communication challenge that they really cannot come back and communicate this back home. So when all of these things are things that you would know that, hey, this would be a challenge for my kid. If they just say some deadlines, remember, 5 different teachers who are teaching 5 different subjects do not coordinate when their assignments are due, which means the week before quarter end, 5 different teachers would have essay deadlines. And if that is not working for your student because nothing is coordinated like they do in elementary, they say, oh, you have a math test today on Thursday, so the English test will be next Tuesday. No, you might have both tests coming on the same day. You might have multiple assignment deadlines coming on the same day. And if these are executive functioning issues for your child, or it is a fatiguing issue for your kid, my daughter could not take 2 tests on a given day. It would be extremely fatiguing for her. Talk to your team, get a rotation of tests put together as an accommodation in the IEP. So there's an opportunity to use a different time, an office hour, or sign up at a different time to go and take the other test and not have 2 tests on the same day. So think about these kind of things, because from their perspective, that's how middle and high school operate. But if it is not working for your student because on the basis of their disability, then it is something you need to address as an IEP team together. So there is a lot more information that comes directly to students. A great way is also to think about guiding your student to get some email formats. Emails are a great way of communicating with teachers. So sometimes you might, or they may send a private comment on a Google Classroom or know what the class's expectation is in terms of communication. So if your student struggles and they need an additional time on their essay, or their accommodation says so and they want to communicate to their teacher that my accommodation allows me for extended time or volume reduction, assist them in making that kind of a template of a letters or an email that they can send to their teachers, so they do not feel like they have a teacher block. If that's an anxiety that they struggle with, like my daughter would not want to go to her teacher and say, you gave me a 0, but I turned in my work. And I would literally have to nudge her to say, it's okay. You know, there's nothing wrong in going and saying that. It's fine. So it helped her when I said, let's write a template. And then when you feel that this is okay, you could send it. So if you can support them, they can also do this independently for themselves, but they don't feel like they're suddenly in this place where they have to take care of everything. It may work for some students, it may not work for others. So here are things that you could do as a parent in the IEP, and even have your youth come and talk about it as you see appropriate. You could talk about grading, the role of presentation versus content. It goes back to universal design for learning and how this will impact different students. So if your student struggles with, say, a Socratic seminar, they should have a different way of being able to show what they have learned without having to do a Socratic seminar, right? So that would be something you could discuss in an IEP and have an accommodation for. Include the youth in these discussions. How talking with the teachers will work for them, right? How is their experience within the classroom? What kind of support do they need? And then bring it to the IEP and put it together in the IEP. This is what my student wants. This is what they need. Everything that you want cannot happen, but whatever the student needs in order to reduce the barriers that their disability imposes, it is part of an IEP discussion. To talk about class notes, can they have a shared note from another student or a staff person? Could they get an audio recording of the class? Could they get like a teacher's note or some of their classes? So what might work? What do they need? And this could be varied. It is not that I need written note for all subjects. Maybe it is math that they are struggling in. Maybe it is history that they are struggling in. So think about it also in terms of maybe in math, you need a different kind of support than in English. So think about what is the impact that the disability has? And it's always how do you reduce the barrier that the disability imposes? And then you kind of have to parse through this, that this is the day-to-day thing that where they need the supports and services for. So we have let's go ahead and we have a couple of more slides and then we can come back to a few questions and hopefully we'll have time to answer all the questions. All right, April. Do you want
Yes, so yes, we can we can both talk about this, but planning for the future, you know, whether your child is on a graduation track or certificate of completion track, oftentimes that planning catches parents and by surprise. It doesn't necessarily talked about at IEP meetings, and oftentimes it's something that parents need to initiate or even ask about. You know, I've mentioned things like planning for school visits to middle school and high school. Kanika has mentioned this as well. In terms of high school, you know, it's referenced here, not to sound too much doom and gloom, but high school, you know, is a little late to discuss graduation requirements, but when you become aware of them, you know, it's never too late. So as soon as you're, you know, realistic expectations in terms of what your child wants to do after high school, that can be discussed with the IEP team. One example would be, you know, if you have a student that is very interested in the sciences, well, realistically, if they were not necessarily ready for a four-year college, which is something that can be discussed in an individualized transition plan, well, what are some of the extracurricular activities perhaps during on campus? Are there science clubs? Are there after-school programs related to science to expose, you know, your child into that interest area? Other things for parents to think about, there are, at least in Alameda County, transition fairs. So there's an Alameda County transition fair that's offered in the spring, and there is another transition fair called Vision for the Future that is offered in the fall. So it gives you, you know, a spring or fall option to think about that individualized transition plan process. Because, and I saw some of the questions in terms of that transition meeting. It can be a meeting that could be rushed, but it's something that I've used as, you know, we talk about it at a part 1 meeting, and then we go more in depth in a part 2 meeting. Sometimes it requires, as Kanika mentioned, you know, you call for a 30-day meeting, you visit either middle school or high school, and then you come back and continue discussing that transition process, whether it's, you know, refining IEP goals, and especially having your student there with the visit, being a participatory member of that meeting, because if your child is old enough and is able, maybe those IEP goals aren't very realistic for that student, and that student and your child can provide input. Sometimes the accommodations might be outdated, and might need a different type of assessment to see what sort of either technology or other types of supports are needed for the student. So having your student involved in the process is important. The other thing that I like to really talk about with my student, or my 2 children, is really, do they really understand their disability? Are they comfortable talking about it? Because that's all part of that planning for that future. and in the self-advocacy that Kanika was talking about is being able to walk up to their teacher and be able to advocate for a grade that might have been incorrect. So while transition and planning is not necessarily discussed, this is something that parents can talk about. And again, bringing in your child into the process is very useful for that. I could probably talk a little bit more about this, but even things like, especially for high school, what are some of the courses and electives that will get your child to where they need, to where their goal is for post-secondary goals? Does your child want to apply for summer internship programs? Sometimes there are middle school type summer programs, high school internship programs. Is your child able, in terms of being able to, again, self-advocacy, are they able to work with potential coworkers, potential managers or supervisors? And again, part of that individualized transition plan is creating realistic and appropriate goals in terms of building those functional vocational skills. Things like understanding things about themselves, whether they have equipment needs, medication needs, other disability related needs. Are there those things that your student or child can advocate for, and also be able to think about as they're planning for their future?
So one thing that I want to highlight is that this document, the ITP document and the process, the individualized transition plan, is a specific plan that is charting out your post-secondary eventually. That's what after high school, what is it that we are looking for? Those 3 prongs that we talked about as the purpose of the IDEA, each of those need to come together in this document as measurable post-secondary goals with annual goals under them that will support your child or your youth in further education, employment, and independent living. And it is an and, it is not an or. It is not that as soon as you've said you've met the credits for college and now you're done, but your student doesn't have any independent living skills. So how do you go to college if you don't have the independent living skills that you may need to survive college, right? So that is the ITPs. Somebody posted, ITP is individualized transition plan. Districts must have a plan for an ITP for a student before their 16th birthday. So usually it is at the 16th birthday or before. That is mandated. It is never too early. You could start early. For some students, it may be something you want to have as part of your IEP discussions, those areas where you talk about vocational, adaptive living in your present levels. So maybe you want to have those little conversations to build together as you move towards transition. So you're not writing an ITP, but you're really building yourself towards that. You could do it through this IEP process. Maybe when your student is 12, you already want to have those discussions. Maybe you're discussing executive functioning in different ways when they are in elementary, like organizational skills, and they look very different as they become middle schoolers and high schoolers. So you have different kinds of goals that are lending themselves to executive functioning or any other category that they may need in order for them to be successfully transitioning out of school. So that would be one thing that you really look at. Someone asked about how our transition IEP meetings run differently than the annual IEP meetings. So annual IEP meetings are annual reviews. They're usually on the dates that typically they go over around your child's birthday, if that's when you entered IDEA, or at, say, my annual IEP always is in October, right? But in October, maybe it is too early for me to figure out what my student might need next year. So I may want to regather with the team sometime in April to figure out what should next year look like. Or maybe I'm even having the discussion in February, right? When I have at least a semester of data to inform me how things are going and what needs to change. So it's just another calling for another IEP meeting for the purpose of discussing next year. So that is transition, right? The ITP is different. That is really thinking about, and here it is, it's a broad outcome-based meeting, this process leading to specific goals towards outcome of preparing school students for post-school life. So a little bit different. So if you're in 5th grade and you call for a meeting for 6th grade and say, I want to talk about where my child will be going for 6th grade, because it's not going to be this school, it's going to be a different school, and I want to have a different discussion about it. That's like a transition meeting, but what you're calling for is an IEP meeting. And the purpose is to discuss transition to 6th grade. So what's going to happen next year? The ITP is a portion or part of the IEP, but it's a dedicated specific document which documents post-secondary goals and your annual goals, which are attaching themselves, which can be reviewed annually, because maybe in 9th grade, your student is thinking, I'm going to be a firefighter. You don't want to say no, you're going to let them think that that is, but maybe that is not something that would probably work for them. But that's not a reason to say no, but then to say, how do we explore this career with you to figure out where that thinking comes from, and how do we support you and guide you through this process? Because a big difference between the ITP process and the IEP process should be seen as, while much of the IEP process, because we have been doing it from when they were really young through when they are in high school, it's driven by parents and the team, the IEP team. The ITP is super important and something completely driven from your child, your youth's interests. What are their interests? What are their strengths? What do they want to be in life? What is important to them? So it is significantly person-centered, and they hold the power there. And that is where we want them to be, because it is their future, it is their adult life, and we want them to have that ownership. So as much as they are able to participate, have them participate and think about how do they want to frame their future? What does that look like for them? And it is the team's responsibility to figure out how to shape that and how to help them and support them in making that happen. So that's kind of where this is. I know that you're having a post-secondary topic coming up in your next CAC, so that would be a good space to discuss at length, because ITP is a whole conversation by itself. So it would be something that you could hold off for there. There were a few other questions. I think this is our last slide, April.
Yes, it is.
All right, so we could talk about some of the other questions that were that you had sent us. So would you recommend families consider scheduling an IEP meeting 30 days? It's not about recommendation, it's really about what you think your child and your needs and what you think is working and not working, like what is important to you and how things are working. So whenever you call for an IEP, they should be holding it within 30 days. And you could have a discussion with your team that, sure, we are figuring out transition. There is only so much you could predict, and some things can change. So you can always come back as a team at any point in time to discuss changes that you think are needed in an IEP. And you could do it, the district could do it too. So either of you could ask for a meeting and hold one to make sure that you're able to use better data and better information to guide the IEP process.
Fantastic. Kanika, if I can pause right there for a quick second. I'd like to prioritize folks who want to ask a question live, and also those questions coming in the chat.
Sure, yes.
So feel free to raise your hand or just hop off of mute if you have a question that you'd like to ask. And if I don't see any hands raised in the next few seconds, we can cut back to the chat for some of the questions that have come in there. But if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or just pop off of mute.
It might be easier if you close the slides and then we can see everybody. There we go. Thanks, Caroline. I don't see any hands raised. Caroline, you want to go ahead with the questions in the chat?
Sure. Oh, there's a hand raised. Eliza, got a question?
Yes, well, I also put it in the chat, but I just wanted to make sure it got answered. My question is, how are the transition IEP meetings run differently than the annual IEP meetings?
So Eliza, do you mean the ITP meetings as a transition meetings?
No, like, for example, how are the elementary to middle school transition meetings run differently than, let's say, the annual IEP to develop the IEP? How are they run differently?
Most often, districts, when they have the transition meetings from elementary to high school, the focus would be more so on the placement. So thinking about, okay, this is where your student will be going for 6th grade. And sometimes the discussions would be, do they need core support, or are they doing like an SDC placement sometimes? So depending on what placement that you're looking at, the focus would be more towards what changes for them in middle school. So say your student is in regular ed and receives resource support in elementary, is that going to change? Is that going to look different in middle school? Is there many middle schools, it is common that sometimes if your student is a resource student, then they're not getting an elective in middle school, and instead of the elective, it is resource. So some of that kind of discussions could happen. You would typically have somebody from the admin team of the middle school come into these meetings, or the high school come into this transition meeting, which you would not have in your annual IEP. It just depends on the timeline. Maybe if your IEP is, if your annual is in February or March or April, maybe they combine it and they also have a transition meeting as part of the annual itself. Like I said, if your annual was in October and there's not enough data to figure out what's going to change in February or March, then you may have a separate meeting. But typically, the receiving school, somebody from the receiving school admin team might attend this meeting, and they would also be able to share any questions that parents may have about that school. And that is a great opportunity to also schedule a visit. Can I come over and visit the school? Would I be able to come and see some, if you have a specific thing about seeing what is super important for your individualized child, then you talk to them about it. Does that answer your question, Eliza?
Yes, thank you.
Can I tack on to her question? When the segment you mentioned about the placement discussion, can you talk a little bit about what if you don't agree with the placement that the district is recommending?
Well, that's always tricky. It's a generic IEP thing and not even related to transition. So if you are in disagreement, then you would have to have the discussion as to what is it that you're disagreeing. As you know, in California, nothing can change unless you provide consent. So you do have, as a parent, the right to say that you are not consenting to this change in placement, and you really need to understand why. And since if this has been working for your student till now, what is changing that tells them that this would not work, and what are their strategies or what are the supports that have they considered. So it's good to have an open mind about both sides of it, but it's also important to know that you have the right to say, no, I still want to try this. And then we come back in 30 days or 60 days and see what's working or what's not working. What are the support we should be trying? So it's important to have that discussion. And yay, for California, it's you have to be providing consent before a change can happen.
Yeah, Kanika and Carolyn, if I can chime in, some districts, and I'm just, might have 2 middle schools, and there might be, some districts have 2 high schools, and which one is appropriate. It's about again, that's where those site visits and tours come very much in handy with your student. How can your child navigate what is comfortable? Because Kanika and I reference, it's about your child, this transition process, them becoming more independent. So that is something to think about when thinking about placement.
I think that's an excellent point, April, especially because when you have multiple middle schools and you say that, but this SDC exists only in this particular school, we need to remember that the students' needs are, their unique needs are more individualized than that program exists only in that place. And if they are going to go and do something else in a different place and they have no friends there and they've grown up in this area this whole time, then that's a really important factor to weigh in and evaluate. So definitely, though, you have to really think. So the IEP is not about fitting your child into an existing thing, but it is to have that individualized educational plan that addresses their unique needs.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kanika. That's such an important point to raise up. I'm going to pull a question from the chat that is actually related to what we were just talking about. Is there a legal time frame from when you request a site visit to when the tour actually happens? And is there specific guidance or language around this?
Well, there is, I do not know of a legal thing within IDEA that would say this, but what I would do is look at your board policy and see what is there. For example, some board policies say that within 2 days, the administration should respond within 48 hours to a parent request for a visit on a campus or to observe their child's classroom. So look at those kind of things and see where your board policy also fits in and see when you would get a response. But I would also say that anything has to come within a reasonable time frame, and that is unfortunately not really guided and defined. But I would think a reasonable time frame is between 2 IEP meetings, which is 30 days, right? So we would expect that we can work with and that this is working together more closer. But if you're not hearing back, it is always great to follow up within 5 days and say, I just wanted to check in with you. I really want to come and visit this placement and see how this can come together. So.
Anyone else have any questions? Feel free to raise your hand, come off mute, pop it in the chat, whichever makes you feel more comfortable.
I see a question. Do you make these accommodations at the transition or once they start, do you call an IEP meeting? Remember that this is not like a distinction that you need to do it at transition or anytime. When you see that so it's important to bring out that, hey, I have these concerns. We have been noticing them, but as we know, the IEP is defined to address what is not working, right? And sometimes a proactive model helps, and sometimes it is like it does not yet have the data. So remember, you have the right to call for an IEP when at any point in time, and the district has the responsibility to take your request and have an IEP within 30 days. So use that to come and have those discussions.
Hi there. I just have a question that I put in the chat as well. We're in the middle of the annual IEP right now, and they keep referring to the transition meeting. Do I still have to ask for it, or is that something that the district arranges?
Is this a transition, the ITP meeting, or is your child?
It's elementary to middle.
Oh, okay, elementary to middle. They mentioned the transition meeting and they say that it's coming up.
Yeah, well, because in the annual IEP, I'm asking some questions and they said, well, we can discuss that in the transition meeting, but I'm just not sure about the scheduling part of it.
And so bring this back and say, if they already have a plan for a transition meeting date, then get that date on your calendar right away. Or
Okay.
just say, I think this is important for us to discuss in these meetings, and put forth your agenda and with a rationale as to why this needs to happen earlier than later for your child. So sometimes you need to visit a classroom and you are thinking of visiting the classroom at, I don't know when your school gets off for summer break, but then by mid of May, there is SBAC testing going on. There's after that, it's all year-end activities going on. So you don't really get a flavor of what you might want to see in that campus. So if that is something that is important to you, then ask for that ahead of time. Just be mindful that everybody is trying hard. It is a very busy time of the year. So giving a little bit of grace to the whole situation helps. But then, yes, you have to discuss what your child needs and ensure that this is happening in the school. So have that conversation. And if this is important to you, say, I understand that this might be coming up, but I really would like to continue having this discussion and conversation now, or put a new date in the calendar when the team and who you believe from the team needs to be present.
And Kanika, I'm just jumping in especially for transition to middle school. Oftentimes it's just, the schedule, what are the electives that your child wants to pick. And that is something that is different than the annuals, because now it's focused on the courses. Sometimes if your child is great at math, there might be some testing where they can take certain advanced placement testing or leadership electives that they can take. So those are the types of transition discussions that can take place. I know that happened for my two children. So again, just a different lens. So it's not necessarily just IEP focused specifically, but just, what does your child want to do in middle school? Because it all leads to, again, that individualized, being able to pick out a schedule. What if they want to take 0 period band? What if there are, clubs and after school activities that they want to talk about? Because all of that documented in the IEP really helps to understand what your students or the child's interests are.
But by this time, hopefully many schools have completed their registration formalities where you already get to pick those, because that's a general ed activity. So you get to pick courses that you want to take and what your choices are, with knowing that those may or may not be offered depending on enrollment and how they do their assignments. But then that's a great point, because you got to remember that part is separate from your IEP discussion, because your child would get band as an elective, and what is the accommodation or support they need to be successful in band is your IEP discussion.
Thank you so much. Pulling another question from the chat. What assessments are used to determine what goals and services are needed for an ITP?
Well, so there are formal and informal inventories around assessments which drive the ITP process. You'd likely hear a bit more about this in your post-secondary presentation, but most schools end up doing something which would be an inventory-based thing, like what are your likings, what are your choices, but you could ask for a complete vocational evaluation. So to have a more definitive, if your student needs a bit more of a stronger vocational evaluation that can provide a lot more data, but then it is both formal and informal inventories that they go through to figure out their preferences, their strengths, their interests, and their needs, kind of thing. So you kind of go through a different processes to see what might be. For some students, they may just say, I want to be a policeman, or I want to go to college. Some students may know that they are like, I want to be a marine biologist because I really enjoy this space and this is what I want to do. I know all of these things about fish and marine life, right? So it really comes down to your students' interests and how it all is coming together.
Thank you so much, Kanika. I have a question for you. Something about some of the requirements around electives, and when it comes to students with disabilities, the absence of choice when it comes to electives, like in certain situations at many middle schools, and I've heard this at a bunch of different schools, that there's a requirement that you take a specific elective in lieu of a choice of elective. Do parents have any basis to challenge that? So for example, and I'll just give like an arbitrary example. Let's say a student has strengths around music or technology or art, and those are electives that are being offered, but they're blocked from accessing those electives because of this mandate that they take a strategies class or whatever it might be called at another district. How can a family navigate that?
Yeah, it is one of the more difficult conversations, especially in middle schools, because in high schools you have a lot more opportunity to pursue these electives, and unfortunately, this is very true in a lot of for a lot of students. Especially for students, say, for example, they have resource and or core support or study hall, whatever it is called, and that is the only class because they need this academic support period or this thing. And I would still go back to saying that is not the individualized portion. And how do you creatively figure out how to access that academic support that they may need while ensuring that they are not blocked from accessing something that their other regular peers are allowed to access. It is a harder conversation, it's a harder discussion, but it really comes down to how you're framing it and how you're bringing the student to come into this discussion and have that conversation. Student voice is very powerful as they go into middle and high school. It's really up to parents as to how they feel about having discussed the disability with their students and how they feel about students. But at some point after the age of 16 and at the age of 18, the age of majority, they are the participants. So building that skill up to doing a student-led IEP, like encouraging them to speak out their vision wherever they can, however they're able to, in maybe a short video of something, is very powerful in bringing into a meeting. If they do not want to participate directly by themselves, or if you think that no, there is other ways in which they could provide that information. So that would be something to consider. I don't know if I answered your question, because this is one of the most complicated questions in middle school, especially for students who are in general ed accessing supports, because I know that many districts, if the student is in special day classes, then they are able to access those electives, but not if they need the academic support and they are in general ed. And then the teachers kind of decide that they need that core support period. But it's still about navigation and figuring out, can you individualize this in a different way? How do you support the unique needs of that student? That would be the conversation.
Thank you so much. Eliza, you have a question?
Yes, I have a question, but I wanted to first, I just saw something in the chat I think is a really important question. Then I can ask after that question. The question was about when the transition discussion should be taking place.
All right, so transition discussion with the team is really also individualized. The mandate is that at or before 16, at the 16th birthday IEP, there should be an IDP, there should be the transition plan. Before that, there is no mandate, but you could have that conversation with your team, and there are some states that are at 14. So you could have that conversation at 14. It really comes down to when you feel like you have all the information or the things that you may need to have this start engaging in this discussion. Like, where are you in that space of the IEP? Where is your student in that space of your IEP? Never too early. The first time I put it in my vision statement was when my daughter was in second grade. And I said, my vision for my kid is that she's going to graduate with a high school diploma, participating in core content standards. Right. So, and that was not for transition or anything, but that was the vision that leads you into it. So what does that vision look like? What does that vision look like for your student? So bring that into the conversation, because that is already part of having that conversation, because that drives what your goals should be. That drives what the services should be. That drives what the placement should be, right? And what we are expecting.
So my specific question is, can we make your PowerPoint available on the CAC website we will post the recording on the CAC website, but could we also have the PowerPoint?
Sure, we would make a PDF of PowerPoint, and so we can send you the PDF version of this PowerPoint slide, so you could post it on your website. That should be okay.
Great, thanks.
Dr. Sweta, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Let me see if I can help you come off of mute.
Thank you. I'm on my phone and I don't know how to use the icons. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I don't know if this is an appropriate question to ask, but with regards to getting the student involved in the decision-making process, I don't know if this could be an IEP goal, but my son used to say he wanted to be a zoologist and a scientist. And as he's, as school's gotten more complex, he just is like, I just want to be a grocery worker. And I know that comes from the hardship of how hard school is for him. So is that something that you would bring into the IEP and create a goal around that about like helping him know what he really wants to do?
How old? I mean, yes. I mean, when my daughter is a sophomore, right? When I think about it, and I'm going to answer your question in two ways, but first, like experientially, when I was in 10th grade, I had no idea what I wanted to be. I definitely am not what I thought I would be, considering I'm doing something totally different from what I was educated for or what I wanted to do in life, right? So it's kind of difficult that we put our kids in a place where we want them to figure a lot about life much earlier in the game. It is important. It is critical because they also need to be able to access their adult life, and they don't have many a times the experiences that typically developing peers do. So it's kind of a balance of both. And we also need to know that that can change. I mean, and it is an evolving process. So even in 10th grade, if you decide that I want to be this, but the next year you feel, yeah, but this year I really like this teacher and I suddenly love this subject. And so I changed my path, right? That always happens. Yes, you can add a self-advocacy goal, but I would also want to understand and ask the question, what has made school hard and how do you support that? So what has changed that has made school complicated, that your son no longer wants to be a zoologist, but would rather go to a grocery worker? Then is there some support that he's missing in school, and what should that look like? So that would be a conversation that you could have at school. Are there accommodations to curriculum? Are there additional supports that he needs in order to feel successful in school? And so what should that look like? Well, so that was my other part to this, that they kind of gave me a red flag as to then something is not working in his supports.
Yeah, and I just wanted to chime in on that. In terms of just the IEP team being collaborative, one of the things to ask is if there's still interest in zoology or just with animals, there's nothing more powerful than just summer programming. Just some of the things that some case managers have said, I found this community college or this program that with young teenagers, would your child be interested? The things that you didn't know about that now you can bring that up. And that's some of the things that my children have been infused with, because, when I think about that, and especially we talked about, the social anxieties and the changes in those expectations in middle and high school. Yeah, that completely deflated, oh, do I want to be that scientist again? But when I said, look, there's this program, in the summer, then all of a sudden it changed. And, having something where it's summer-based and not necessarily academically focused during the school day was changing. So again, not IEP specific, but just something else to think about. There's never take for granted those enrichment opportunities, whether it's after-school programs and things like that. So.
I want to get to a very good question in the chat, and I deeply, deeply appreciate you all hanging in here with us. When might be, and kind of, I think you touched on this when you mentioned your daughter's vision. when might be a good time to discuss with our children and the IEP team around choosing diploma track versus certificate of completion track? When should families start having that in their brain as their student is moving along educationally?
It is very individualized for students. I think we always want to start with the thought that our students should have equal expectations of things. When any student enters school, they expect that they will graduate with a high school diploma. And so that would be the thing. But given that there might be individual circumstances and things that are different, you could have that conversation, and it should never be cut in stone. It's never that, right? It's an ongoing conversation. And with the thought that this is the path, and the certificate of completion is really an additional option for students to have that. Remember, students with disabilities can have an IEP and still continue to work towards a high school diploma till they are 21 or 22, right? Until 22, depending on your birth date and those specific stuff. But then you have that option to continue. So look through that, look at where you are, look at the gaps, think about, individualize what is working for your student and what that is. But really the expectation for families and for students, for all students in school districts, is that they are graduating with high school diploma. And so it's a very individualized question. So I would say that have that conversation always, watch for figuring out how this is working. Remember that when there is significant modifications to the curriculum, then you are not really working towards a diploma. So look at those kind of signs and figure out, but that does not mean that we want to make this so challenging that school becomes a frustrating experience for our students. So figuring that out is part of that IEP process. So think about that. And as you go into high school, when you look at middle and high school needs to be looked at as the 4 years together. So if you look at it as single years, it's much harder. But if you look at it as 4 years and think about your district's requirements, the state's minimum requirements, looking at the new alternate tracks that are coming up, thinking about how all of this can apply towards your student, and then thinking about, if my student has 5 years to finish, does that look like a reasonable way to do a diploma? If they have 6 years, if they need 6 years to do it, how do you spread those courses? And is that still achievable? What does that mean and what does that look like? So you really have to think through high school as one big group of things where you're kind of moving some of the cards. So you look at all the requirements together and see where things fit in. It's not a direct answer because this is a very complicated question in my mind. And it's really, when you say, sure, my child can only do certificate, you kind of also have that thought that what data told us that. So it's really about knowing how to drive that data to make sure that the data is reflecting what is true about your child.
Dr. Sweta, did you have another question, or is your hand still raised from before?
My hand is still raised because I don't know how to put it down on my phone.
That's okay. I just wanted to
Sorry.
check in.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
No problem. Does anyone else have any questions? I think I got to everyone in the chat. Kanika, April, thank you so very much. We're getting a lot of praise in the chat about how informative and helpful this presentation has been. So thank you so much for providing this information and being available tonight to present and answer some really thoughtful questions from our participants. Thank you all for joining us this evening. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a beautiful evening.
Thanks, you too. Good night, everybody. Thanks so much for being here.
Night, everyone.
So I don't think I have the ability to stop the recording. I think that's on your end, Katie.
You know what? There's no recording icon, so I'm going to end the meeting because I think that does it automatically.
Okay. Thanks so much, Katie. Appreciate it.
Okey doke.